Want to roll it?
Okay, well, our speaker today is Stephen Wicker. He's a Cornell professor in computer sciences and has some significant expertise in copyright and privacy, and will be talking to us today about artificial intelligence and our privacy.
Thank you, Kirk, and thank you for the invitation. And it's nice to see all of you and some familiar faces as well. So what I'm going to do is jump right in and let's see if share screen works. This is roughly my 1 millionth Zoom call, but it's still always a challenge. All right, let's see. Here we go. Now, if I'm lucky, you see my first slide. Is that right?
Yes,
Yep.
with the sidebar.
Well, can't win them all. Okay.
Just go ahead and start the presentation.
Okay. What I'd like to talk to you all about today is.
It means switch to slideshow.
Oh, okay.
We should probably all mute.
Agreed.
Did that work?
Not yet.
All right. It says slideshow. Let's see. How's that?
No
Don't
change.
see the sidebar.
Okay. Well, hopefully it's not too distracting. I don't want to take.
Okay, we can just run.
Because I do have it on slideshow. Okay. So again, what I wanted to talk to you all about today was some of my work in two different areas, two areas that are coming together, namely artificial intelligence, which we hear about daily, and location privacy, which we probably don't hear about enough. You should now be seeing the second slide. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, so it's a set of converging trends that I've been tracking. The first has to do with a collection of location data, something that's been going on for a long time. It actually began with your cellular service providers back in the early 80s. And it's just been accelerating ever since. It's culminated in something called the Google Sensor Vault. As you may know, Google knows an awful lot about you, so I will say some more about that later in the talk. I'd also like to talk about AI, and AI is treated as magic by a lot of people. It's a fantastic thing. It can do all kinds of tricks. Well, it's actually just a set of algorithms. They just happen to be quite powerful algorithms that run on very powerful platforms. So I'll say a little bit about that and then give you an idea about an actual AI algorithm, something called constraint satisfaction. And this will lead to some very powerful tools that we should be concerned about. I should note that one of my jobs in this talk is to scare you. So there will be a little bit of that. And let's start with trend number one, cellular data collection. The reason cellular systems collect so much of your data, and in particular, your location data, is because of a decision that was made back in the 1970s. Here was the problem that 1G cellular faced. You see those hexagons. The coverage area is divided up into cells, and each cell is associated with a base station. That's great. How do we route calls to mobile users when we don't know where they are? To which cell should we send the call? That problem was solved by having each and every phone transmit a message, a registration packet every few moments. And so the nearest cells pick up these transmissions and they record your location. This started with the very first cellular systems back in 1982, and they've been doing it ever since. So at this very moment, if your cell phone is on, it's transmitting registration messages, actually several times a minute. So all of this information is collected and it's kept forever, as you might imagine. So cellular data collection's been with us for a long time. It has accelerated over time as we go from generation to generation. As you probably know, we're now in the 5th generation, and people are already talking about 6G cellular, mostly academic. I think 5G is going to be with us for a while, but each generation tends to last about 10 years, if you want a rule of thumb. So with each generation, you get higher data rates. You can stream movies. You can do all kinds of things with your cell phone now. More powerful computing. You can do more complicated things. And there's finer grained tracking. Not only do they know which cell you're in, but they can also tell whether you're home, whether you're outside in the front yard, and those sorts of things. Now, one of the things that has moved this location issue along has been the use of apps. Now, as you're probably aware, lots of apps use location data. You may not know that some apps use location data, even though they've got nothing to do with location. There is a famous app, Angry Birds. It's a game. It actually collects a huge amount of information about you while you're playing that game. Okay. This is all part of something I call cellular convergence. We are doing all kinds of things on our phone, whereas before we just used to talk. There was a day when your cell phone would do nothing but allow you to have a voice conversation. Well, that day is gone. It passed about 20 years ago. Today, just about every form of electronic communication that you may want to enjoy can be done on that one single platform. And because of this cellular convergence, we no longer need, what were they called before? I've even forgotten the term, personal data assistants, PDAs, the Palm Pilot, and those sorts of things have been put out of business. Most pagers are gone. All you need is your cell phone, and that's what cellular convergence is. But what this means is that when you use that cell phone, you're providing all kinds of data to the service providers. Now, with regard to the apps, they've grown phenomenally. The initial App Store was opened in 2008 by Apple. It had something like 800 applications, apps available. As of today, there are 2 million iOS apps and almost 3 million Google apps. So there's a lot of apps to play with and collect your data. Okay, now why is this important? I note that the data is owned by the individual app providers. So if you're using, for example, Google Maps, Google knows where you are, where you want to go, which address you put in, which store you're going to. They own that information. And the reason that's important from a privacy point of view is, and a legal point of view, is because of something called the third-party doctrine. A very long time ago in the world of cellular, back in 1979, the Supreme Court decided in a case called Smith versus Maryland that if you willingly give your data to a third party, you have no reasonable expectation of privacy. Now, to give you an idea of how old this case is, it involved a guy named Michael Lee Smith, who was not a very nice person. He had robbed a woman, and then after the fact, he was harassing her. He was calling her up and saying lewd things. He wasn't very bright either, but he was calling her up and she complained to the police, and the police put something called a PIN register at the central office. Now, this is an old device. What a PIN register does is it simply collects all the phone numbers that you dial on your nice old-fashioned landline phone. So this PIN register collected all the numbers that Michael Lee Smith was dialing. And they found that he was indeed calling this woman. And so they used that information to get a warrant. They searched Michael Lee Smith's house and found some of this woman's property. And he was subsequently convicted. Well, he complained. He said, under the Fourth Amendment, the police should not have been able to put a PIN register on my phone line without a warrant. They needed a warrant to do this first. And the Supreme Court said no. Quoting Justice Blackmun, we doubt that people in general entertain any actual expectation of privacy in the numbers they dial. All telephone users have to convey telephone numbers to the telephone network in order to make a call. People know that. No expectation of privacy. So this very old law regarding dialing phone numbers is now being applied to all the things you do on your cell phone. So something to think about. By the way, there's a distinction that's made in the law between the content of a call. If the law enforcement officers want to tap my conversation with you over the phone, they need a warrant. In fact, they need something called a super warrant. To tap a phone line, you have to jump through all kinds of hoops. It's actually rather hard to get. To get information on the context of communication, who was called when, how long did the call last, and all the other things we put into our phone, you often don't need a warrant. You just need a subpoena, which, as some of you know, is a lot easier to get. Okay. This was the state of the law for quite some time up until recently. All of the data, all that tracking data was treated as context information. It was easy for the police to get. And that was the case right up until the case of Carpenter versus the United States. Now, this gives you an idea of what you can do with location data. There was a series of robberies in Detroit, Michigan over the course of 4 months. And one of the thieves was caught. And that thief handed his phone over to the police, who subsequently took all of the information off this cell phone. Now, the police, in searching through this phone, were able to identify 16 numbers that they thought were interesting. And so they went to the cellular service provider to find out whose numbers they were and where these people were during this 4-month period of time that the burglaries were occurring. So all they had were the phone numbers, and they used those phone numbers to find out who the people were and where they were during these 4 months. Well, it turns out Carpenter was close, very close to 4 of the robberies. He was subsequently convicted and sentenced to 116 years in prison, all of which started with his being associated with this person's phone. Well, this case went to the Supreme Court. And in this case, the Supreme Court changed their opinion somewhat. Okay, in the decision of 2018, there was a 5-4 decision, which was close. Okay, 9 justices, the majority wins, but often it's close, which indicates there's some other thinking going on. What the majority decided was that the government had violated the Fourth Amendment by accessing the cell site location info without a warrant. By asking where those people were during that 4-month period, they violated the Fourth Amendment rights of those people. They should have had a warrant. Now, the court went further. It recognized something that it hadn't recognized before. It said that all of this data is detailed, encyclopedic, and effortlessly compiled. The court recognized that I can tell you all about your life history just using this location data, especially as it gets finer and finer. What they concluded was that there should have been a warrant. In order to get this location data, you need a warrant. Now, what's telling about this decision is that there were a number of dissents. And what they said, what the justices said in dissent, is a little frightening to me. The first dissent was, this is a bad decision because it impedes law enforcement. If the law enforcement officers want something, they should get it. Okay. The second dissent was interesting as well. They said the conclusion was correct. A warrant was needed, but the rationale is all wrong because this data, this location data, belongs to the cellular service provider, not to the individual. Okay, so a warrant should have been served on the cellular service provider. Okay. Now, I had a second trend I wanted to bring to your attention, and that's of the subject of artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence is simply the development of algorithms that give the appearance of intelligence. Okay. Sometimes they behave like humans. Sometimes they behave like really, really smart computers, but either way, we call it artificial intelligence. Now, the applications of AI are many. I've just got a few on my slide here. Speech, for example, the conversion of text to speech and back again, that's an AI process. Excuse me. Vision, machine vision, image recognition. These are classical AI problems. They were studying image recognition when I was a grad student, roughly 1 million years ago. And there's other applications of AI as well. What I would like to talk a little bit about is a particular AI problem called constraint satisfaction. Now, this is a classical AI problem. And there are a number of classical problems. The 8-queen problem is just one of those. The problem is we want to put 8 queens on a chessboard such that none of them attack one another. Now, this can be done, and I'll show you the solution in a moment. But first, let me say a little bit about the AI algorithms and how they attack this kind of problem in constraint. So I'm using a 4x4 board, as you can see on the diagram. And let's start on the left. A typical AI approach to this is simply to put 4 queens down and then count the number of ways they attack each other. So we have 5 different attacks going on. As you know, a queen can attack diagonally, horizontally, and vertically. So we see 5 different attacks. And so we associate a heuristic with that number 5. Now, the next thing we do in an AI algorithm is develop some way to move closer to our solution. We want to drive that H value down to 0, where there's no attacks. And so we have to have some sort of heuristic that tells us how to move from our initial position to another position that has a better H value. And the way we do that is by searching what's called a local neighborhood. We're going to start with those 4 queens on the left, and I'm just going to move one of them. And I have a way of making this choice. We'll just assume I've done that. My choice will be to take the queen in the second column and move it up 1 square, as you can see. We're now in the middle diagram. That one movement is good because it's driven my H value from 5 to 2. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is search my local neighborhood again. What are my simple moves? And it turns out there's one, taking the queen in the third column and moving her down 1 square, that gives us a solution. So now we have 4 queens on our 4x4 chessboard that satisfies our constraints. They're not attacking each other. Okay, so what have we seen? And by the way, the 8x8 version's on the right. It's not the only solution, but all other solutions are a version of that solution. Okay, so we've had something called a local search algorithm. We start with a random position and then we make small changes, hopefully improving our performance until we get to a solution. Okay, this is a very standard form of AI. It's a constraint satisfaction problem, and there's lots of fancy names. We talk about gradient ascent, simulated annealing, genetic algorithms you may have heard of. They're all different techniques that take a similar approach. Start with a random position and then gradually move toward a solution. Now, one thing that has made the news, but in an indirect way, is this notion of the neighborhood. We search a local neighborhood to find our solution. Well, that neighborhood can be defined in lots of ways. It can be defined in terms of people's personal characteristics. You may have noted facial recognition has been a very hot topic for artificial intelligence researchers, and one that's controversial, because in defining the neighborhood for identifying whose face you've got on the camera, we may literally be looking at one neighborhood instead of another and creating bias in our algorithm. So there's a lot of potential for bias in these approaches. That's a subject for another talk. So let's keep moving along. I mentioned Google early on. Google has been busy collecting data since its inception. It started by simply collecting information about your searches. What are you searching for? Is your search statement grammatical or not? How did you form it? There's all kinds of information about you that goes into your searches. Think about that next time you search for something. Well, Google went beyond that quite quickly. Google started collecting people's addresses. They started taking pictures of people's houses, creating their Google Earth process. They got in trouble in Europe. Google has been collecting data of all kinds for a very long time. And they have put all this data together in what they call Sensor Vault. It's a vault that has virtually every kind of data imaginable about yourself. And it may have data about you even if you don't use Google, which is interesting enough. But one of the primary things it's got in its vault is information about everyone that uses an Android cell phone. Okay, it knows where you've been. By the way, I'm mentioning a book here on the bottom left. If you're interested in this topic of how companies like Google have acquired all this data without asking permission, have exploited it in different ways, and the way the legal system has tried to keep up, often failing, you might want to take a look at this book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. She's done a really, frankly, a brilliant job of capturing how this movement of data collection has created an entirely new economy. Okay, but let's keep rolling. So what's the problem with Google having all this information? Well, let's stick to law enforcement, but bear in mind, Google can sell this information to other companies as well. But sticking with law enforcement has noticed that Google has all this information, and they've created something called a geofence warrant. This is relatively new. It started in 2016. But basically what happens is law enforcement sends a warrant to Google and says, give us all your information about what happened in this particular area at this particular time. Okay, so from January to June 2020, they've received tens of thousands of these requests. 20,000 roughly were with search warrants, 15,500 with subpoenas. Remember, a subpoena is much easier to get. And 83% of these requests resulted in disclosure of user information. So let's see what one looks like. This is an actual warrant that was served by the 18th Judicial District for Palm Beach County, Florida. And this gives you an idea of what they're doing when they go to Google and ask for information. Okay, on the right side, it's a search warrant. It's been served on Google Incorporated, large company, and it's asking for location data. Any devices using Google location services that are within the following locations. And then we see Google target identifiers, what's being asked for, and a series of latitude and longitude coordinates. This search warrant is asking for everything Google knows about what happened in that quadrilateral within those 4 points and within a particular period of time on March 7th, 2016, between 2 a.m. and 8 a.m., a 6-hour period. All right, so there's a process that's followed when Google gets one of these geofence warrants. As you can see, number 2, they search their entire vault, go through all the information they've got, and respond with a set of anonymized identifiers. So Google says, here are the anonymized identifiers for everyone who was in this place during those 6 hours. Law enforcement then sorts through those identifiers and picks out a few that look particularly interesting. I was going to say unsavory, but interesting, of potential use in the case. And then Google, upon receiving this cut down list, will provide the actual names, email addresses, and so forth. So a lot of information is changing hands. Now, this is particularly worrisome. Now, I note that in this particular case, the search warrant is dealing with a murder case. Someone lost their life. The police are trying to find out who did it. It's a great reason, okay? But at the same time, there are legal issues that arise from this kind of warrant. It's almost certainly in violation of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment requires a number of things with regard to search warrants. There has to be probable cause, and there has to be a statement that particularly describes the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Well, that's not happening in a geofence warrant. All the police are saying is, Google, please tell us everything you know that happened in this particular place during this particular time period. There's no other than the fact that a murder's been committed, there's no probable cause with regard to the individuals whose information is being handed over. So this is more of what's called a general warrant. which is one of the reasons we had a revolution back in 1776 or thereabouts. General warrants specify an offense, but not who's to be arrested or what's being searched for. It's a fishing expedition, a very fancy and well-detailed fishing expedition. So it's a problem. And these are things that I've been working on and trying to figure out to what extent this is a problem. We know that Google is applying AI to these searches. The initial Sensor Vault searches have taken up to 6 months to complete. There's a lot of data. It's an incredible amount of data. But Google's ability to apply AI has been increasing over time. Google, for example, has bought many AI companies to increase its expertise. I spent all of 3 or 4 minutes compiling a list of a handful of companies that were purchased just in the last 10 years. That's a lot of AI intelligence that is now under Google's control as Google applies algorithms like the constraint satisfaction algorithm to all of its data. Now, one of the things that is a constraint is the neighborhood, as I've mentioned, and we don't know how Google defines its neighborhoods for its searches. It's simply something that we have to trust them for, and that might make some people uncomfortable. Okay, so how do we solve this? What kind of policies should be recommended to the federal government, for example, in dealing with these issues? I've been fortunate to give talks to congressional staff. I gave a talk at the White House a few years back on dealing with issues like that. And one of the questions they ask is, well, what should the policy look like? How can we come up with policies for dealing with all these powerful algorithms and this huge amount of data and still treat people fairly? So my suggestions would be to require warrants for all third-party data. There is a reasonable expectation of privacy in the data that we give to various companies, in part just because there's so much of it. It says so much about us. So this data, if it's going to be handed over, should require a warrant. There should be no geofence warrants. It is a fishing expedition, and certainly no secret warrants. If the law enforcement agencies are looking for data about you, that might be useful for you to know. And of course, include the search terms. We have to have some way of evaluating whether a particular search has been biased in some way. That's important, especially if we catch someone who's done something horrific. You know, we want to make sure that all their rights are being observed so that justice will be served in the long run. All right, and we should also acknowledge that when third parties get this data, it creates issues with regard to targeted advertising. Now, I haven't talked about this so much today, but as you can imagine, all of this data that Google has collected is being used to target ads. That's their main thing. That's how Google makes its money, for the most part, is targeted advertising. And they know an awful lot about us. And that, of course, makes the advertising that much more efficient and powerful and concerning to a lot of folks. And then finally, we need to change our culture of corporate surveillance. We need to be able to tell companies, you just can't collect data about me and treat it as your property. This is the main theme of Shoshana's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And it's a theme of a lot of people's work, including mine. There has to be some respect for individual dignity. You know, we have to be able to say that when I generate data about myself, for example, looking up a medical condition on the web, I should still be able to maintain my privacy. It's a serious concern. Okay, well, I will be happy to take any questions about this work. And I will release you from the sharing here so I can see you. People are still present. That's great.
So Steve,
Yeah.
you were talking about the various algorithms and how they sort of almost reflected intelligence. To what degree has this met the Turing test?
That is a fascinating question. Of course, as you know, the Turing test is basically you're communicating with an entity that you can't see. And you want to be able to judge from those responses to your questions whether or not that entity is a computer or a person. There's a Turing test that's actually run annually. Actually, it's probably several, but many people feel that we've passed the point where the Turing test has been successfully satisfied. Computers that at least can answer in a way that will fool individuals. It's not going to cheer you up,
Alan
I know.
Turing?
Yes, that's the same Alan Turing who was in the movie. Oh goodness, I'm forgetting the name of the
Wonderful
movie.
Mind. It's a
Right.
Wonderful Mind.
Mine was John Nash.
Oh.
It was Benedict Cumberbatch played Alan Turing. Anyway, Alan Turing did a phenomenal job as a cryptographer and a cryptanalyst. He's one of the folks who broke the German code during World War II. So fascinating guy. I think he's now on 20-pound note or something.
Sometimes we get notices on our phone that an app or whatnot would like to track us, you know, and you usually have choices of don't allow, allow, or allow only when using the app. And I usually select allow when using the app because it certainly can be helpful to navigating what I'm doing. Is that in general a wise thing to do? What does it make a difference?
First off, it does make a difference. With one or two notable exceptions, if you tell a particular app supplier not to share your information or not to use certain information that's on your phone, they will generally abide by that, especially if it's an Apple environment app, because they don't want to be thrown out. Apple is notably sensitive about privacy. So it's at least trying to be one of the good guys. Now, is it a bad thing to do to allow your data to be used by third parties? It depends. Your susceptibility to advertising, whether or not you've got sensitive information with regard to your medical condition. There are things that you might not want on the open market. For example, it could affect your insurance prices or something like that. So as long as you're selective, I think it's okay. Because you're right. I mean, there is a trade-off. You get extra performance by sharing this data. You know, we do get benefits from Google. It's a great search engine. We get benefits. I was about to say Facebook. I'm not so sure about that. But Facebook, you know, sharing pictures of your kids and grandchildren, that could be fun. There are other ways to do it. But Facebook is the other end of the spectrum for me from Apple. But long answer to your question. Be selective.
Steve, you suggested, if I recall your slide, that there should be no secret warrants. Now, in your murder suspect case, does that mean that the suspect under legal or law enforcement review should be informed that there's a Google search about him or her?
You know, I could see there are downsides to that, and I haven't thought through all of them. The problem occurs when Google is basically sharing something that they acquired from you with a third party without letting you know. And the warrant is just one example, sharing it in this case with law enforcement. It would be an impediment to law enforcement if they knew that you knew that your information was being shared and that they were on to you somehow.
Stephen, I enjoyed your talk. I use Firefox, and it has an option where I say I don't want cookies. So more and more now, when I go to look at news sites or things like that, they won't let me in unless I agree. So more and more of the even if we want to, I don't even know if I say no cookies, whether it is protected or not, but more and more sites are preventing me from even looking at their home page. And this is sort of a de facto way around saying I don't want cookies, because a large part of the internet becomes inaccessible.
That's a really good point. There's really two issues here. There's cookies, and then there's the ads that you get bombarded with.
Yeah.
when you reach out to the NewYorkTimes.com, for example, the web page that's sent back to you has all kinds of links to ads. And if you've got an ad blocker, often that web page will not load. The basic idea here is that corporations who run a website have certain rules, and if you're not going to abide by those rules, you may not get access. That seems fair, although they put ads in there without telling you they're going to do it. But let's set that aside for a moment. With regard to cookies, cookies contain information about what you've done on the website, and then they're used by third parties through an exchange process to send ads to you, basically, that are highly targeted. You can accept the cookies and then scrub them immediately afterwards. That's not a problem. You shouldn't have to serve as a data repository for your personal information like that. So what I do is every time I shut down my browser, I have an app that cleans out all cookies that have accumulated. And that way I can still see everything without too much.
How do you do that?
Okay, so I've got a program called Cookie, of all things. It's called Cookie 5. I'm using a Macintosh. It is great. I can verify that it is indeed scrubbing out all of my cookies that accumulate when I'm reading the newspaper.
Steve, I've got
On
a
my
very,
PC, I use CC Cleaner for the same purpose. Originally called Crap Cleaner, but cleaned up to go CC Cleaner.
They cleaned it out. That's a good one as well. I'm familiar with that one.
I've got a
Some
very
of the
simple
browsers
question
have
for
a
you.
setting that will allow you to scrub cookies when you leave the browser too. It's just, you find it somewhere by digging deeply into the choices.
Yes. It's often hard to find what's been stored, and I often wonder if they do it on purpose. A lot of
Steve, is there
What
anything
if
different
we-
with somebody under community supervision who has specific search conditions and the application of a warrant under those circumstances?
Okay, so if someone, for example, may have been told they're not allowed to use the internet, or they're only allowed to use it for specified reasons, then those people know that they are under surveillance, and that's a different side to the law. As you know, that's, in my mind, once you're into that process, you've given up your right to use the internet for whatever reason.
I have a question for you. On my cell phone, if I turn off my location data, does it really turn off my location data?
What it does is it turns off the ability for different apps to obtain your location, but it does not turn off the fact that your phone is continually sending registration messages so that AT&T or Verizon or whomever knows where you are all the time.
Well, I have a cottage right on the border between the US and Canada. If I want to scoot across the border, if I turn off my application data, can I be caught?
Yes.
Yes, is a simple answer. For example, if the police sense that you're doing this, you've got some nefarious smuggling operation that you're operating out of your cottage. Not saying you do, but assume that. They can go to AT&T and say, may we have Ken's location data, and AT&T will provide it. And your location data, by the way, as we go up to 5G, that location data is becoming pretty fine grained. So they would know, for example, whether you're in your home, outside your home, across the street, et cetera. Well, I regret that I have a PhD exam that started 5 minutes ago, so I'm going to have to leave.
Thank you very much.
I would be happy to answer questions another time, or perhaps Kurt can relay some questions. I really enjoyed this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.